Howdy, everyone, and welcome to Moment of Truth. My name is Saurabh Sharma, the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
And we have another fantastic episode for you guys today. American Moment is one of the few groups that's trying to stitch together what the cohesive agenda for a new or realigned right would look like. And one of the issues that, I spend some time worrying about isn't getting enough attention these days is foreign policy. We have to make sure that restraining the American military and directing our foreign policy towards the national interest remains a core of this new agenda for a new right. And so to that effect, we've wanted to start bringing on some guests that will talk about those issues. And we have one of those today. John Allen Gay is the president and founder of the John Quincy Adams Society, which in some ways, although this is a little bit of a silly way to put it, is American Moment, but for foreign policy, except they've been around for a couple of years now. They were founded around the beginning of the Trump administration, and they're really focused on building a community on campus in Washington, D.C., and in professional circles for people who are purely focused on questions of foreign policy realism and restraint. They have a bunch of fantastic student programs, they do conferences, and they do a lot of other important work helping build out a cadre in a lot of the same way that we're trying to build out a cadre for this broader ideological project, specifically for foreign policy. John is an absolutely brilliant person, extraordinarily well-read, makes both Nick and I feel like dum-dums for sure. And he really had a lot of fantastic stuff to say. In addition to his leadership at the John Quincy Adams Society, he used to be the managing editor at the National Interest, which is a great realism and restraint magazine and digital publication that, in fact, Nick has written for before. And he's also the co-author of a book with Geoffrey Kemp on War with Iran, Political, Military, and Economic Consequences. He holds a master's degree in international relations from Syracuse University Maxwell School and has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the College of William and Mary. I thought it was a fantastic episode. Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, it was great. One of the things I really like about John is that everything that he talks about is from, the perspective of the national interest. So when talking about foreign policy, particularly in the national media, looking at, if you've ever watched a panel on CNN, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's always a bunch of lazy moralizing. It's, oh, well, if we do this thing might happen, and then we'd feel bad. And I think John has a really good way of looking at everything through the prism of being for the American national interest. We also talk a lot about history today, which presidents are good and which ones are bad. I forgot to move the Teddy Roosevelt bust before John got here, but I don't think he was too offended.
Yeah, for those of you who've been paying attention on YouTube, and we really recommend you do, we put a lot of hard work into making sure this production is as high quality as possible. We have a rotating set of different little statues and tchotchkes that go up behind the speakers and also on our desk.
They're really like Easter eggs, kind of.
That's right. That's right. Keep an eye out for your favorite figure of realignment. But in fact, today when I came in, originally we had on the set behind John's head a bust of Julius Caesar, which I thought was a little bit incongruous with a message of foreign policy realism and restraint. So I swapped that out.
And we also had to convince you to not add Napoleon to the set.
Right.
I would like the audience to know that.
Well, we admire John a lot, and so we didn't want to mess with him too much. When he comes back the second time around, we'll make sure we haze him properly. But it was a great episode. We hope you guys will give it a listen, and we'll cut to John now. Thanks for coming on the podcast, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Saurabh.
The first thing that we always like to talk about is sort of how people got to the point where they are now. You've had sort of a windy journey throughout Washington. You're actually older than you look. Why don't you explain how you got to the point where you're leading the John Quincy Adams Society?
Yeah, well, I've been in Washington almost a decade now, which a lot of people don't realize. When I met one of the big scholars a few years ago, and he said there's kind of a Doogie Howser thing going on here, which is probably even too old of a reference for you guys.
No, I get it. As a fellow redhead, I get it.
Okay, so. There you go. Yeah, we got 2 out of 3 here. But I started out in the think tank world. I was at the Center for the National Interest. I was as an undergrad, I took a bunch of IR courses. I was really excited about realism and was slowly realizing there's not a lot of realism in Washington foreign policy circles. And so when I was looking in grad school for internships to apply for in the summer, and I go to their website and it says America's Realist Voice on the front page of the Center for the National Interest website, I said, boom, I want to go there. So I probably wrote a really good cover letter and I was interning there. And I was working on a Middle East project related to Iran, related to the nuclear program of Iran, the military option against the nuclear program. And I overheard the young woman who I worked for, my immediate supervisor, talking about how she was leaving. She was getting hired out. And so I went to her boss and said, hey, I'd love to apply for this role. You know, nobody asked me to do it. Nobody even told me that it was happening. I literally just overheard it and ended up getting the role. I think it helps to be someone that people know. And that was pretty much the story of the rest of my time at that organization, at the Center for the National Interest, and then the National Interest, their magazine, where I ended up at the end of my time there as the managing editor of the publication, primarily working on the web side of the publication. I was always falling diagonally upward where someone would leave, and I guess they just couldn't find anybody better. And so I ended up being the one that they selected.
That's awesome.
And then in 2016, as the foreign policy debate was heating up, the space was opening up for conversation. I was actually at the speech that Trump gave on foreign policy at the Mayflower Hotel on April something in 2016, before he was finalized as a candidate. And there was a lot of great stuff in there, a lot of realist messaging, which I think got a number of people in the realist community pretty excited. I caught wind of this idea that had been percolating out there of having a youth organization, a professional pathway into the national security space that is dedicated to realism and restraint. And I was really excited about that and got plugged in with the people who were looking at it and said, hey, I'd like to head this up. And so that's how we got rolling at the John Quincy Adams Society. Been there ever since, expanded onto a lot of campuses. We're really trying to build the next generation of foreign policy leaders for this country and to build it with people who favor a more measured U.S. approach. And that includes progressives, conservatives, libertarians, all kinds of people who, if you're in the younger generations, you've seen a lot of failure in foreign policy, in U.S. foreign policy in your lifetime. And so we find it's a pretty easy message to sell.
So let's rewind a couple years to another president, John Quincy Adams. Sure. Let's talk a little bit about, what he kind of stood for and how that guides the mission, and founding principles of your organization. Can you kind of tell us more about how that influences the way that you guys work?
Absolutely. John Quincy Adams is more known for his extensive diplomatic career, and I think that's what we're really pulling to. His presidency was a single-term presidency, lost to Jackson, not a particularly memorable president, but he was Secretary of State before that for Monroe. He served as an ambassador to a number of countries, the Netherlands, Prussia, Russia. I think there were one or two others in there, England, the UK. And over the course of that career, he was formative in shaping the direction of early American foreign policy, which looked very different from our foreign policy today. There was a lot of use of force, a lot of expansion, but it was aimed toward the development of our own country. It was internal, or to areas that we saw as internal. And we were trying to stay out of all of the conflicts in Europe among the European powers who were the big dogs in that day so that we could continue growing. And those powers kept trying to ensnare us in their conflicts, mainly the British and the French, trying to draw us in, get us to be on their side. There was a really formative episode for JQA in 1793, 1794 or so, where a French representative came to the United States, didn't even present himself at the Capitol, started going around like South Carolina, trying to recruit people to become privateers against British fleets, which was a major violation of America's policy of neutrality between France and Britain. And I think this showed a lot of early American foreign policy thinkers, including Adams, including George Washington, that countries are basically out for themselves. Even though in the case of France, we saw their revolution as having some ideas in common with ours, and there was a lot of enthusiasm among ordinary people for it. And so that formative idea that countries are ultimately going to be looking out for their own interests really informs a lot of Adams' own thought. And he says, look, we stand for certain values in the world, but ultimately we are responsible for ourselves. And we would actually endanger our values and our national project if we end up getting in a lot of these conflicts involving the European powers, if we try to expand ourselves, particularly all across the Western Hemisphere, if we try to spread our system of government at the point of a bayonet into South America, et cetera. He said he has this famous speech while he's Secretary of State on July 4th, 1821, delivered to Congress, where he says that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that's really the line everybody remembers. The whole speech is brilliant, but the next few lines, he talks about how we are the well-wisher to all, but we are the champion and vindicator only of our own. That the purpose of American military force is something that has to be closely tied to the national interests, and I would say the vital national interests of the American people and the American nation, and that we shouldn't be sticking our troops in all these other conflicts all over the planet. You know, as a military brat, that really speaks to me, because the people that are going and fighting in these conflicts are people like members of my family. You know, I know what it's like to have a member of my family overseas in harm's way. You know, whenever the phone rings, to be sitting there thinking, is this going to be a casualty notification? Whenever someone knocks on the door, you know, getting nervous. And so that really spoke to me that our military needs to be deployed in service to our national interests, not the national interests of other countries.
Mm-hmm. I find that John Quincy Adams is really the figure that restraintist and realist point to, and it sort of feels like there's a very thin, you know, layer at the bottom of the barrel, and he's basically it. And there's really no one else to name organizations or initiatives off of. Are there any other leaders that, in American history specifically, that sort of stand out as great representatives for this way of thinking about foreign policy?
Sure. Well, George Washington is another, and I think you can make a decent case from history that Washington was influenced by Adams' own ideas, even though Adams was much, much younger than Washington. Really, all of the founders, I think, were a model for this, of a more restrained vision of foreign policy. Pretty much everybody before McKinley kind of got it and kind of looked at Washington's farewell address, which talked about also about staying out of these European entanglements, and said, you know what, this is a good model for us. They read it every year in Congress. I think they still do that, but they must just not pay attention to the foreign policy parts of it. And so really anybody from that generation, a friend of mine is a big fan of Grover Cleveland, who opposed our expansion into Hawaii. You could really, again, point to anybody in that period as a great model.
I feel a little bad for having the statue of Teddy right there. Maybe a little triggering for this episode. But I'm actually reading this book right now. I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but it's about Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and I'm forgetting his first name, but Hearst, the newspaperman, in like the rush into the Spanish-American War, and basically how it was recommended to me by Jake, our third co-founder, and it's basically about how all these men of high society kind of came to the realization that, like, oh, we've expanded as far west as we can go, and they were feeling idle. They were prone to, like, this is pretty well documented in Teddy's life. Like, he was prone to nervous fits because he couldn't, get out west and get away from, like, the stress and that sort of thing. So he constantly agitated towards war. Like this book, it has like excerpts from all of his letters. I mean, he was writing to several different people several times a day saying, man, if I can only just get people to to go to war with Spain, and then I can lead a regiment down there and I can like get the glory that I've been searching for. And a large part of the reason why he wanted to do it was because his father during the Civil War had paid like volunteers to go on his behalf. And he always felt like a lot of shame, I guess, on behalf of his father that he wasn't like honorable enough to defend his country during the Civil War. So I know that there's a lot of, and listen, like I'm a big, I'm very guilty of this, of idolizing Teddy Roosevelt, but I think it's important to have a nuanced view of him as, someone who did a lot of great things, but also, at times had a misguided view on foreign policy. I guess that's kind of a rant and not a question, but I mean, what is your kind of perception after McKinley, where things went wrong?
I think it's during the World War II period where you see the real change, because to speak of Roosevelt, he really expanded the interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine from Europe doesn't get to come over here to we're going to manage a lot of stuff in Latin America, which is a real transformation of the original Monroe Doctrine, which was also written by John Quincy Adams. The Coolidge administration actually clawed that back a bit. They had a very long document called the Clark Memorandum, which essentially restored things a bit more to a less assertive posture in Latin America with regards to the Latin American powers, the powers indigenous to this hemisphere. But then you see through World War II, in the early days of World War II, there's a great book called Tomorrow the World by Stephen Wertheim over at the Quincy Institute, historian who has argued pretty convincingly that a lot of the national security elites in our country began to feel that we needed to be managing the world and leading global order over the course of 1940, 1941, 1942, very early in the conflict, realizing that Britain is going to get knocked out, that this was where we started shifting in this mindset from let's stay out of all these conflicts overseas to let's be involved in them and try to have a thumb on the scale and shape them to our liking or prevent them from happening, make factions we like win, the ones we don't like lose, being really involved and quote unquote engaged, to use a popular DC euphemism, in a lot of these affairs.
That apparatus and that mindset that you describe has over time congealed into something that people call the blob. What is the blob? In your own words?
I would say it is the people and process that make up the establishment consensus on foreign policy in Washington. Every policy community is going to have consensus processes. And I think it's much stronger in foreign policy because we are so removed from pressure from voters. A lot of voters vote about taxes, healthcare, things like that. So there's much more of a tendency to have two political elites rather than one, aligned with different factions, presenting substantively different ideas. But there's basically a consensus among a lot of the higher level people in Washington that we need to be highly involved in the world from a security perspective, that we need to have a whole lot of troops abroad, that we need to have a whole lot of commitments to other countries that if they get attacked, we'll go to war. That we need to be sending carriers and stuff off the coasts of all the countries that we disagree with, that we need to be having lots of disagreements with other countries in fairly far away regions that might not be all that capable of harming us directly. That's what I would say the consensus is. And that consensus has a social reality, namely that if you disagree with it, especially strongly, even though there are great reasons from history and from scholarship to disagree with it, that you start to become a bit of a persona non grata in Washington. I think that was more true probably 10 years ago when I first came to Washington than it is now. There's been a lot of space opened up for debate. I think also the structure of the international system is forcing people to have a more honest conversation about the limits on American power and also the limits on American interests. We just can't afford to be all things to all people all the time. Now that we have a rising potential peer competitor in China, now that we've spent the last 2 decades at war in the Middle East. And I think the blob is reacting to this shift by trying to hold on to its power or make small accommodations where it'll say, okay, yeah, we're not going to do dumb wars anymore, but we're still going to have plenty of, again, engagement, which always translates into heavy military presence, heavy diplomatic presence, heavy involvement in other countries' politics, the kind of things that can expose us to risk, provoke resentment, all of that put us in the middle of a lot of stuff that we are just not well placed to understand. That's what I'd say the blob is.
So you mentioned other countries' politics. That kind of triggers a follow-up question for me. How does the intelligence community play into all of this?
Well, their mission, I think there's a twofold answer to this question. Their mission is to provide information to our policymakers so that they can make informed decisions. And whenever you build a capacity like that, you end up building a capacity that is also capable of covert action, of doing things secretly in other countries, because that's what you need to do to gather really interesting information. And so I think the intelligence community can sometimes be a reinforcer for the blob. That a lot of the people who have risen to the very highest levels will have at least some sympathy for this expansive managerial account of what the U.S. role in the world should be. They also have a unique advantage in the communications and politics world, which is they have secret information that they can say, well, if you really knew, or they can selectively leak stuff that gets into the press and shapes narratives. It's a big problem. It's also illegal when they do it. We had a member of the Obama administration admit in Politico at the very beginning of this week to sharing secrets with his wife, which is, I think, a felony. And he's probably not going to face any consequences for that, which is another part of having a blob in Washington. It's that people can get involved in all kinds of failures, all kinds of illegal stuff. And if you buy this consensus, you can still ultimately continue being a player. There are people who have admitted or pled guilty to lying to Congress who still end up heading up major initiatives, signing prestigious letters here in Washington within the foreign policy circle. And we'll have people on the other side of the aisle defending their status, defending their right to be appointed as a policymaker.
It's one of those things where the social component of it is so interesting, right? Because it is only an environment that is capable of closing ranks as intensely as I think the foreign policy community is so capable of doing, that could make it so that felony, concealing information from Congress or lying to them is basically okay and does not make you persona non grata in this space. But if you differ even slightly in some ways from the consensus of the last 40 years, that makes you a pariah. I mean, is there any sense that does the blob realize that it exists? Do people who are sort of rank and file members within that community realize how cloistering that environment is, or are they sort of oblivious to it?
If somebody really hates the term blob, they're probably in the blob. Just like if somebody really hates the term endless wars or forever war, they are probably part of the consensus that supported that.
Or making money off of it.
Also true. Yeah, I think there definitely is that social reality there. And there's an incredible lack of self-awareness. We saw an incident a couple of weeks ago at the Atlantic Council where a couple of scholars wrote a pretty traditional realist analysis of the situation in Russia and Ukraine and basically said, hey, human rights are important, but they could be an obstacle to us getting other things that are higher priorities done in our relationship with Russia, especially if we push really hard on them. That is a classic realist take. You could find it anywhere for decades, ever since human rights has become a major plank in our foreign policy. And yet, another center at that think tank had something like 20 scholars write a letter denouncing this opinion and saying that they disassociated themselves from it. That was what the letter said. It was very short. And after they released it, they were all kind of tweeting self-righteously about it, that it had to be done. They talked to Politico and said it was a slap down, that it really needed to happen. They told some of these scholars to go back to the Cato Institute, because the Cato Institute has a more restrained perspective on foreign policy. And, I think this was a real example of the blob in action. And there was a similar example a few weeks later. Biden tried to appoint a realist to his NSC to be his director for Russia. And this guy's a fairly moderate realist. He does not have radical views on Russia. He doesn't see them as a potential partner. He says, look, we just need to limit our competition with them to certain spheres. That was way too much for these folks. And people started leaking against him. People started saying he was like a Russian agent or something like that. I mean, this happens like several times a year. And it is remarkable, really, especially in the Russia policy community, what people will say about their colleagues behind the cloak of anonymity. And it is in an effort to destroy people who are disagreeing with the blob. And I say this having said earlier, and I still believe that things are better than they were like 10 years ago, because this was constant and there was much less pushback. The thing at the Atlantic Council, there was a lot of strong negative reaction to that among other think tank scholars saying essentially the point of think tanks is to think. You ought to be having disagreements with your colleagues, and you don't need to be sitting there saying, I'm going to disassociate myself with these views. And because of that, I think it shows that the Overton window has opened a bit, and restrainers and realists are more welcome in the foreign policy discourse now, which is a good positive development.
Well, and that's the other thing, too, with all these like security state leaks and that sort of thing where someone would anonymously leak something and then the person that it was leaked about was called like a Russian agent or like a Russian puppet. Speaking of Overton windows, right? I think it really kicked that open to where now anyone who disagrees, gets called a Russian puppet or a tool of Putin or whatever.
Especially under a Biden administration.
Yeah, I know. I was following the the NSC thing pretty closely. So I've talked about it a little bit on the podcast before, and you and I were discussing it before the show, but I used to do a lot of work on Arctic policy here in the United States. Some of that dealt with United States relations in the Arctic vis-a-vis Russia. So since you brought it up, would like to talk about Russia. What is, how do you feel about kind of this traditional mindset in Washington, this Cold War mindset that Russia is still this big like geostrategic threat, our number one enemy, and what would you kind of suggest the way moving forward with Russia or against Russia or whatever is?
Well, look, they certainly are a threat. They have thousands of nuclear weapons. So by definition, they are an existential threat to the United States. But the thing with existential threats is there are different ways to manage them because we have a whole lot of nuclear weapons too. We can say a lot about their capabilities. They clearly have an interest in covert action, in espionage, which is pretty normal for high-level countries to be spying on each other. They've done some pretty remarkable, not good things in their neighborhood, interfering with the sovereignty of countries like Estonia, like Montenegro, like Ukraine, most obviously, like Georgia. But because they're a great power, they also have the ability to resist us pretty effectively. That's pretty much what makes a great power a great power. If you were to listen to a scholar like John Mearsheimer, it's the ability to resist another great power. And what that means is that we have to take that into account in our policymaking. We don't have to like what they do. We don't have to agree with what they do. We don't have to agree with their values, with their system of government. It's highly corruptive. It's a bit of a mafia state. And yet we have to live in a world that they live in. And we can do that through a lot of confrontation and ultimately provoke a lot of these negative responses. Or we can focus much more narrowly on our national interests. To speak of Ukraine again or Estonia, these are places where our national interests are extremely narrow. Like, we would like those countries to be free. And if they, are oriented toward the West, we might support some of their development. But they are not a vital interest to us. They are not on our border. They are on Russia's border. What happens there is a lot more important to the Russians than it is to us. And that difference of stakes is a huge structural problem that we've been trying to overcome. You follow the think tank discussion scene. They're full of war games and scenarios and planning of trying to figure out how we could defend the Baltic states, which are members of NATO that are right on Russia's border, that have a combined population of like 6 million. They are really a grain of sand on the scale of global geopolitics. They are not a group of countries that I would argue we should be defending at all. And yet we are sitting here talking about having different types of nuclear weapons and different force postures that could be pretty aggressive in that area because we see it as in our interests to defend them. And so I think really it needs to start at home. Foreign policy starts at home, and it starts with us reevaluating what our core national interests are. And I would say in a region like Europe, it's a balance of power. It's nobody running the show. It's multiple players, hopefully working together peacefully with one another. We get to trade with them a lot. Everybody wins. It's great. But ultimately, we just need nobody to take over. And Russia is not actually about to do that. Europe is more populous, more prosperous, better armed, and certainly capable of being way better armed than the Russians. And in a lot of ways, the reason the Europeans are so weak is because we provide security for them. The Germans were showing up at exercises a few years ago with broomsticks painted like guns. I mean, this is the former terror of Europe that has been reduced to spending almost nothing on its defense. They have a lot of broken tanks. They can barely put a lot of their aircraft in the air. They had, I think at one point, no operational submarines when they basically invented submarine warfare. It's kind of a joke, and it's because they're living in our basement, really, as a power, and we need to kick them out.
I think that's something that's really interesting, about the Baltic states. I hadn't really thought of this. Like, the population only being 6 million people, like that's smaller than the state of Minnesota. Like Minnesota has 8 million people, like for reference. And everything that we've been, talking about for years about like potentially, getting ready to go to war with Russia over 3 countries with populations smaller than like one of our states. Mm-hmm. That's just very interesting to me.
Yeah, it puts it in context, right? I mean,
yeah.
The United States is one of the largest countries in the world. And so when people in the United States think of how big countries are, they're like, oh, something maybe a little bigger, maybe a little smaller than the United States. That's just not true. Like most countries are smaller than American states. The Russia issue, I think, is really interesting, right? Because it's one that I think belies the survivorship bias, maybe the wrong problem here, but when you have the same, maybe the wrong term actually, when you have the same people leading the foreign policy space as did during the Cold War and the immediate aftermath, I mean, Russia is the nail and they're going to keep beating it with a hammer. Are you starting to see a little bit of a generational shift in how foreign policy thinkers approach Russia as one generation replaces the other, or have they been very good at maintaining that mindset as a status quo even in subsequent generations?
I think by and large, there is a divide between millennials and down and Gen X and up. Because if you're Gen X or older, you have a lot more living memory as a policy person of things like the 1989 revolutions, the spread of democracy in Eastern Europe during the mid to late 1990s, maybe a bit less active memory of how bad things got in Russia during that same period during liberalization, which kind of affected how a lot of Russians view the prospect of being a totally Western style society. So there's definitely a generational divide because, again, for a lot of millennials and younger, it's endless war and endless confrontation that is the foreign policy that we know. But that said, the institutions in Washington are largely blob aligned. And so there's going to be ideological diversity in any generation. And I think people who line up more with blob perspectives have better prospects as long as the blob is the stronger player. And so there's still a structural problem, even though I think there is a bit of a generational shift happening.
The next region that I want to talk about is China. This, I think, is the most critical issue for people who are in Nick and I's camp, these more realigned conservatives, to be very careful about, because the framing on China that people like President Trump presented over the last couple of years was, I think, primarily oriented around questions like our trading relationships. What is happening now, I think, is that the blob is starting to bring its framing on the China issue into the fore. And there's a real risk of what I think was an important reevaluation of our relationship with China turning into a casus belli for war. What is it that, how do you think about the China issue as it relates to the right, as it relates to foreign policy more broadly in Washington? And what are you concerned about?
Well, I really liked the way in American Moments Principles that you framed the issue, where you talk about them as more of an economic competitor than as strictly a security competitor. Now, China is certainly a very capable security competitor. And I think as we are building our military and thinking about our security, they're kind of the pacing challenge. They're the ones that we should be keeping an eye on. Their capabilities are the ones that we should be lining up our capabilities against. We should be focusing more on naval power because the Pacific is mostly made of water, whereas a lot of our effort has been going into the Middle East and Europe, which is mostly made of land. And so we've been putting a lot into our Army and our Marine Corps in order to fight in those places. So we do need a shift in the alignment of our forces. But more broadly, I think the question at the geostrategic level about China is how big it can get, what it wants, but also what it is capable of taking. And a lot of us are bringing a historical model of Europe and European security and Middle Eastern security into the way that we think about China and its potential for expansion. And if you look at Europe from a geopolitical standpoint, the whole northern half of Europe is called the Northern European Plain. It's wide, it's open, it's long. You can pretty much go on flat terrain all the way from Paris past Moscow. And what that means is that's good terrain for warfare. If you've got tanks or cavalry back in the old days, you can do a lot of rapid gains, rapid conquests in that area. And so it's naturally going to be a highly securitized region when there are multiple powers competing over it. And it's going to be harder to get security in that environment. The Pacific looks a lot different. It's made out of water again. It's big and open. There's a lot of ocean. And the thing is, it's really hard to project power consistently across the ocean, especially if the ocean is contested, which we happen to have the world's best Navy. And I think that we should continue to aspire to doing that. And a lot of China's potential targets, it's going to have to either go through mountains and cross through mountains full of people that don't like them into lowlands full of people that don't like them, places like Vietnam.
Yeah. Or literally the largest mountains in the world in the Himalayas.
Yes. Yeah. You read about some of the confrontations that India and China had several months ago. A lot of these places barely even had roads. You had to move your forces up there like for weeks to acclimate them to the environment. These are not easy areas to project power through. It's the same story with oceans. You get a couple submarines, you get some anti-ship missiles, which are getting really good these days. And it's going to be pretty difficult to, for instance, mount an invasion from China of Japan or of the Philippines or of Taiwan even. And so they're actually constrained a lot by their geography. And we need to recognize that. I mean, also, those other states that they are adversaries with, those states have really strong incentives to look out for their own security. And we can leverage that rather than trying to be the leading partner in every alliance, which is often what we've done. We essentially have Korea and Japan as junior partners in their own defense. In particular, Korea, there is still a unified command structure where in the event of a war, Korean forces and U.S. forces in Korea are both under the command of a U.S. commander. It's something not a lot of people outside the Korea specialist community know, but it shows just how a lot of this primacist hegemony posture in global affairs is as much about having our allies be weak so we don't have to sweat what they're going to do on their own as it is about keeping our enemies from getting too strong. And I think that that's a mentality that forgets that self-interest that states have in their own preservation. So we need to be leaning into that. I like the idea of having more cultural competition with China where we're saying, hey, our model is better. and trying to prevent, for instance, Hollywood studios from saying, yeah, we're going to make, Mulan over in Xinjiang, and we're going to have thank yous in the credits to the local security bureau. I think that that's appalling. And ultimately, I hope that the American people will reject it. But I think that that's different from pursuing a Cold War style high level security competition with China, which I think is really not necessary.
Taiwan specifically is interesting to me because what the blob will say is that Taiwan is at imminent risk of a land invasion. Sounds like you aren't as concerned about that. Why is that not as concerning as people may make it out to be? And what should our broad approach with Taiwan be?
Well, I think there's definitely a prospect that China will attempt something against Taiwan. That they could try to turn them into Hong Kong 2, where they have them in some level of political subordination that might involve military elements. I think one of the greater dangers that would lead to that happening would actually be U.S. and Taiwanese activities that are provocative, that are suggesting, hey, Taiwan's going to go independent. China has no hope of ever reclaiming it or being reunified with it, which I certainly hope it's never reunified with China because they have a much better system of government, particularly after the late 80s, than the People's Republic of China does. But we need to be talking about our own national interests here. We would very much like Taiwan to be free, but we can live in an Asia where China has been able to take them. I think that the military questions in the region get a little bit tougher. It would give China something of a better position, but it's not necessarily going to be the beginning of a Chinese empire because they still have all these problems if they try to go after Korea or Japan, which are the real engines of the region, or after Australia, which is also really far away and really capable, after Vietnam, etc. Ultimately, what we need to be doing is leaning on some of these powers to stick up more for their own defense. In the case of Taiwan, we've been providing them a lot of these high-end weapons that, as far as a lot of experts can tell, they're basically just buying in order to stay on our good side because they're industrially valuable for us, to sell them, for instance, tanks, which if you've looked at a map of Taiwan, it's mountains and a lot of very wet lowlands that are not that great for armored warfare, and urban areas, which are also not that great for armored warfare. And so us selling them tanks, us selling them high-end fighter aircraft angers the Chinese, but actually does not do a lot to make Taiwan that much safer. And I've heard gossip that the Taiwanese tanks that they have are not very well maintained, not very operational, which would be consistent with that theory that they're just doing it to stay on our good side. So we should be encouraging them to become really prickly and hard for China to swallow, getting anti-ship missiles, air-to-surface missiles, anti-tank missiles, preparing to fight urban warfare, preparing to fight on the beaches, which they've already done a lot of, making it so that they're really hard to conquer, and so that the People's Republic knows that if they try to subordinate Taiwan, that it's going to be a continuous bleeding sore for them, rather than an easy reabsorption of just another province. That's, I think, what a better Taiwan posture looks like. They can have as many weapons as fall off the back of a truck in the United States, not necessarily an American defense guarantee, which is what a lot of folks in the Taiwan area are pushing for right now.
Yeah, it strikes me, a clever Taiwanese diplomat acting in their national interest would realize that a really good way to keep the U.S. engaged in your region is to keep Raytheon contractors really happy, and so to purchase up as much of the defense equipment from them as humanly possible. No, that makes a lot of sense to me. What are some of the things that Taiwan could be doing to make themselves much pricklier? And is there any sense of sort of a new regional bloc being formed in that part of the world that is capable of counteracting China on their own terms, as opposed to relying on American hegemony?
It's a perennial problem in Asia that there's not a lot of regional cooperation among the major powers, particularly Japan and Korea. They've got a history, to put it lightly. Korea was colonized by Japan. I used to live in Korea, and I would walk by these statues of people who had been killed fighting the Japanese. It's still an ongoing issue that Japan has not really gone through its historical legacy and kind of atoned for some of those things in the way that, say, Germany has. And so there's a lot of friction there. I think a realist would say, hey, these states have very strong reasons to cooperate. And if the United States is sitting on top of them and saying, we're going to defend you no matter what, that actually reduces those reasons to cooperate. I think the lack of an Asian security system is partly a story of the United States. I think in Taiwan's case, they really need to be hardening themselves, building a highly capable military. I think a lot of it is going to come down to sensors and shooters, that they need a lot of radar systems that can be looking out into the Taiwan Strait, that can be looking up over the Taiwan Strait and shooting at things that are coming at them, and having a lot of them, because the Chinese are going to be taking a lot of those out. They have a pretty advanced ballistic missile force, for example, that we can assume would be used pretty heavily against the Taiwanese. And so if you can really just make it so that it's too costly for China, I think that that's going to make it much less likely that they would attack, because they see it as a political legitimacy issue in the case of the PRC to reintegrate Taiwan. But they also don't want to lose a big war with Taiwan. That's also a political legitimacy issue. And I think making it so that that's the case is the key. But again, we can do that with the Taiwanese rather than doing it for the Taiwanese.
Yeah, so I want to ask you a little bit about some of the rhetoric that goes around, about both China and Taiwan, but also in the Middle East. A lot of the feedback that you get from people when you say, hey, we shouldn't be, involved in this war because of X reason, the response is almost always, oh, well, how could you? Like, you don't care about the humanitarian reasons, behind this war. You don't care about these people or whatever. What do you say to that critique?
I think one, great powers have to make very tough decisions. The international system is highly complicated, highly competitive, and that means that cut and dry moral questions are often not going to be as cut and dry as they seem. Afghanistan is a really great case of that. The Taliban is absolutely awful. I fully agree with that. But we are not exactly allied with the greatest government in history in the government of Afghanistan. It is extremely corrupt. A lot of that is our money. There's a lot of involvement in the drug trade. The big structures in Kabul where politically connected people live that they'll call poppy palaces. And there are also a lot of political figures who have been absorbed into the Afghan system that are essentially warlords. They were warlords before the Taliban got knocked over. They still are warlords now. I'd particularly point to one of their vice presidents, General Dostum. I know this is a family podcast, so I won't repeat all of the things that he has done that are also pretty darn serious human rights violations. And so I think we need to realize that we are operating in a morally complex world, and often these are not going to be cases of black and white. And by the way, war is also a moral question. Fighting in conflicts can be just, but it still has a lot of moral costs to it. That's always going to be the question, whether you're choosing to go to war, whether you're choosing to continue to go to be in a war, whether you're choosing to give a country a defense guarantee that you will go to war if they get attacked. That check is going to be cashed in blood. And we can choose whether it's going to be American blood or somebody else's blood. And it's unfortunate if it's anybody's blood. But as a country, we have a responsibility toward our own citizens and our own military to only use that in the case of our most vital interests. So I think these narratives of moral simplicity about really any conflict abroad are often eliding the fact that war is an ugly business.
Well, they're crocodile tears too. I doubt that a lot of these people, actually care about the morality surrounding our foreign entanglements. For a lot of them, it's a lifestyle of not being held to account, and not basically being held accountable for the things that they've espoused, over the last couple of decades. Basically, in short, they don't want to admit that they were wrong.
There's an element of that, although I'd actually push back a little bit. I think a lot of these folks genuinely believe it and genuinely believe in spreading human rights, which again, human rights are really good. But there's often a selectivity in how folks think about it, which I think is not often very conscious. It's, hey, it's an ugly world. We're going to have to make some compromises with some human rights violators. So yeah, we're friends with Saudi Arabia, but we're enemies with Iran. And from a human rights standpoint, I'm not sure you can make a case that that is a categorical distinction, that Saudi Arabia is just categorically better than Iran on human rights. And yet you'll hear a lot about human rights in Iran and not a lot about human rights in Saudi Arabia. And it's a kind of self-excusing, actually, as a great power to say, hey, we have some things we do out of necessity. They're not who we really are. But the stuff that the other guys do that are bad, those show who they really are, that they aren't also making ugly, complicated decisions.
Speaking of Saudi Arabia and Iran, what is your assessment of the state of play in the Middle East right now? Coming out of the Trump administration, the Abraham Accords, we're now looking to a potential withdrawal from Afghanistan. What does the state of play look like? What's concerning you right now, and where's there a cause for hope?
Well, I think the Abraham Accords are actually a great cause for hope. I'm on record from several years before them that I think for the U.S. to get less involved in the region, one of the things that would be really helpful is increased cooperation between the states that are unfriendly toward Iran, Israel, the Saudis, the UAE being the main players there. So I think it's a very helpful development that we should be continuing to encourage. I think it's a major accomplishment on our part. I mean, a lot of it was already happening because they have this common enemy that really helped it along. But yeah, we should be doubling down on that. But beyond that, I think there are reasons for us to be optimistic that we can continue pulling back from the region, shifting our energies toward home or toward the Pacific if we can't shift all of it home. The main challenge in the region, just like in Europe and really any major, prosperous, populous region, is we don't want one power to control it, because then they would have kind of a whip hand in dealing with the rest of the international system and could accumulate a lot more power. I mean, that's pretty much what we did in our prosperous, populous corner of the world called North America. And so you need a balance of power to prevent that. And I think in the case of the Middle East, there is a lot of contestation around exactly where that balance lies, but I don't think that the danger of one power coming to dominate everything is as great as people realize. The Iranians are a pretty broken society. It's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It's badly governed. It has an unpopular system of government. And a lot of the fighting that they do, they have to rely on outsiders to actually do it, on folks from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, from Lebanon. They have a lot of problems as a country. They have a lot more people to divide their limited oil wealth among. They're pretty isolated among their neighbors, and they have a pretty low-class military. There's a reason they do all this unconventional and asymmetric stuff, and it's because they're not very good at the conventional high-end stuff. Their Air Force is flying planes that were new when disco was new. And so we need to really right-size that threat. Every country in the region has some serious obstacle that prevents it from becoming a major power. At least one of those obstacles is going to be the other powers in the region. Iran has to compete with Turkey, with the Saudis, with the Israelis, with every other player in the region. The Saudis have a lot of problems too, mainly just that they're not as big as the Iranians are. Their system of government is also going through a lot of reform. They're trying to transition to a post-oil era. Israel is, the most capable at the high-end level, but they're small. But they're also kind of far away from some of the other players. So there's nobody who's really poised to take over. I think the region that we need to focus on the most is that western end of the Persian Gulf. It's where all the oil comes from. And that's still a major ingredient to the global economy. as long as nobody's about to run that whole show right there, we can pretty much sit back and ensure that that continues to be the case. But because these are self-interested states, they don't want to get conquered even more than we don't want them to get conquered. And we can leverage that rather than trying to take care of it for them.
How do you think of the risk of a state like Iran, and I think a lot of the same conversations apply to North Korea as well, acquiring a nuclear weapon? That seems to be a lot of the telos behind American, aggressiveness in the region. Is the threat of Iran getting a nuclear weapon as big as it's made out to be? Is there any way to live in a world where that is the case? How do you think about it?
It's certainly a threat. It's better to live in a world with fewer nukes than a world with more nukes, and especially more nukes in more hands. And we might see some of the other states in the region try to acquire nuclear weapons if they were to acquire it. However, nuclear weapons are kind of like a gun being pointed at you. When you have them and you suddenly are faced down with these other nuclear powers that are posing existential threats to you, it really has a clarifying effect on the mind. And ultimately, within a few years of nuclear acquisition, a lot of nuclear powers have had some sobriety injected into their foreign policy, especially as regards other great powers, for that very reason. You can't afford to do crazy stuff. You can't afford to take huge risks as reliably as you can when you don't have nukes. So they can actually create some challenges for countries that have them. They are not just a security asset. They're also not good for doing coercion, for making other countries do what you want them to do. They're mostly good for deterrence, for keeping other countries from invading you or nuking you, because those are existentially dangerous things. There's a great book on nuclear weapons. Nuclear Weapons and Coercive Diplomacy is the title, by Todd Sexer and Matt Fuhrman, two academics who have taken a look at a lot of these cases of states with nuclear weapons, trying to push around other states, including states that don't have nuclear weapons. And they found that, look, it's not actually that much of a coercive asset. I mean, we still have a lot of problems in our foreign policy, even though we have nukes. Russia doesn't get everything that it wants, even though it has a lot of nukes. China doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because it's hard to credibly risk existential threat, to risk your own destruction for something, for instance, that you've just conquered, that you've been living without for decades, hundreds of years, to then say, I'm going to nuke you if you try to take this thing that I took back. It just is not a very convincing argument. And so nukes are not as much of an asset to states as you would think. And ultimately, our posture is going to be what it already is, which is deterrence.
So staying on the topic of the Middle East, I want to ask you a little bit about, Biden's position on Afghanistan and the withdrawal of American troops here later this year. There was an interesting piece in the Gray Zone about how Biden is not, he is pulling out U.S. troops, but that a lot of that responsibility for security in the region is being shifted to private contractors and mercenaries and that sort of thing, and really just kind of shifting responsibility from the U.S. military to these private organizations without accountability. What do you make of that, and what's the way forward for America in the Middle East?
I don't expect, in the case of Afghanistan, that there are going to be a lot of contractors sticking around after we withdraw, simply because the Afghan government is not going to be as reliable a protector of those contractors as we are. I think it would be a similar story if we withdrew from Iraq. A lot of the militias and mercenaries are actually local in many of these countries that are being hired up to do tasks for the government of those countries. I don't expect that there's going to be a major ongoing U.S.-aligned mercenary presence in several of these countries that we're withdrawing from, because also mercenaries cost a lot of money. And in a lot of these countries, there's a lot of desperate people who are pretty easy to hire up if you need people with guns to go do something. So I'm skeptical of that narrative. I think there certainly has been a lot of privatization in the national security state that has happened, but I think that particular problem is likely a bit overstated.
Mm. How do you think about the withdrawal more broadly? I feel like, foreign policy restrainers, especially when it comes to this part of the world, are sort of, Lucy snatching the football away in a lot of cases. We promised we're going to withdraw this time. Are you actually confident that we're going to be out of Afghanistan come, this time next year? Or is it going to be the same story? Extensions, delays, reneges?
I'd say I'm 80-20 confident that we're going to be out of Afghanistan in the particular case of Afghanistan, just because a lot of the rhetoric that Biden has been using on it has actually been pretty good. He's been talking in terms of American national interests, in terms of how much effort we've already put in there, in terms of the tremendous cost that we have paid, mentioning his own son's service in the Middle East. And so I think rhetorically, he is positioning himself to be hard to attack on that issue. And I don't think there's going to be a unified Republican opposition to it, because there's also more intellectual diversity in the Republican foreign policy debate these days. And I don't think many people are going to see it as a winning issue to say, oh man, we withdrew from Afghanistan. The only way that that's going to happen is if there's a terrorist attack. And even then, it would have to be convincingly linked to Afghanistan. And I think that's pretty unlikely. A lot of the terrorist threat that we see is homegrown. It's people who are here, are radicalized here. It's really hard to get from rural Afghanistan to downtown New York. And so that's just going to be a big challenge for them. So I think politically, Biden has made some moves that are going to make it hard for him to go back. So I think in the Afghanistan case, I'm optimistic. In the case of Iraq, middle of the road. I think that a lot of the folks involved in the policy there might want to be sticking around, trying to shape things. Shaping is another DC euphemism for being involved, having a lot of forces there in harm's way, potentially getting shot at. That situation is a much tougher one. And there's been a transformation slowly over the last several years from fighting ISIS there to containing Iran, which is a much taller bill. We don't have the forces to do it there. We don't have the partner government doesn't really have any desire to do that beyond putting some limits on Iranian power. And in the case of Syria, I would note that at the Democratic National Convention, they had the former special envoy for Syria talking about how bad it was that we had withdrawn from there. And then we didn't actually withdraw, but he's now involved in the policy process. So I'm guessing that we are still going to be in Syria for at least another 2 years. Wouldn't shock me if by the end of a Biden term, we are still there.
Yeah. So want to ask you a little bit about how people can get involved with your organization and other organizations like it if they're not looking to get into the blob space. How can people, get involved in foreign policy on the right side of things?
Yeah, we'd love to be an asset to people. The John Quincy Adams Society, our website is jqas.org. We've actually got a conference coming up in June. That's on our website too. We've got a lot of the top IR scholars, a lot of really interesting thinkers are going to be speaking to our audience. We're going to have some professional development stuff, some campus leadership development. This one's going to be primarily geared towards students, but if you're an early career professional, again, just go to our website, sign up. You can shoot me an email, john.gay@jqas.org. I'm happy to talk to anybody about this stuff and help folks get rolling on their career. We have a newsletter that we send out every week that has a huge roundup of job openings that we've kind of handpicked from around the foreign policy scene that you can sign up on our website for. And from there, we'll talk to the individual and figure out what's best for them.
Have you seen an uptick in the interest from people in getting involved in foreign policy, maybe specifically on the right, after President Trump first ran in 2015, 2016?
I think that's the case, and I think it has certainly made it more acceptable in circles on the right to have interesting non-blob views on foreign policy. It's no longer, for conservatives, it's no longer about trying to out-hawk the other side. I think that there are folks who are learning a new way of talking on this that are, they're very pro-troops, but I think they're making an argument kind of like I made at the beginning of this episode, talking about we need to only send them abroad in defense of our most vital interests. They're putting their lives on the line for us and shouldn't be sent abroad cheaply. And, you've seen folks like Matt Gaetz, Ken Buck, a number of others have kind of stuck their neck out on this issue. There are folks like Rand Paul who were out there a long time before that. And the space has really opened up. And I think the fact that, we live in a partisan country means that when Trump was out there doing some stuff that was aligned with a more restrained foreign policy, he was cueing a lot of folks who are mostly just motivated by partisanship to also support that. And that's going to make it harder for the John Boltons of the world to drive a really hard, aggressive line in foreign policy and expect that to not get disputation.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the debate stage in 2024 looks like for the Republicans, because even in 15, 16, it was sort of Trump speaking in one way and the rest sort of competing for just how many bombs they would drop on the Middle East. I in some ways get worried because I think that a lot of the difference is going to be purely rhetorical and not substantive. But even that is in some ways a modest victory when people aren't trying to outgun each other on how much war they're going to get into. I think there's a lot of cause to be broadly optimistic. John, thank you for coming on our podcast. Thank you for everything you do at the John Quincy Adams Society. And we can't recommend highly enough that people get involved with y'all. You really know what you're doing in that space, and we're excited to work together in any way we can in the coming years.
Thank you for having me.
Talking with John Allen Gay can't help but make me think about how different Generation Z and even some younger millennials think about foreign policy when it comes to whether issues like the Middle East, like Russia, like China, like any of the rest. We lived fundamentally different lives than our parents did, than our grandparents did. And so to have the exact same posture when it comes to foreign policy is somewhat an anachronism of how good at indoctrinating people so much of the blob is. No one has been better at talking about this than Jake Mercier, our chief creative officer here at American Moment. He wrote a piece in Real Clear Defense that I think we may have even talked about on the podcast before, but I keep coming back to it, called Generation Z and Foreign Policy, Building a Common Vision of Restraint in a Divided Era. And he sort of lays this out. He says, look, if you don't live in a world where you experience the Cold War, or you experience the 90s and all the different conflicts that happened in Europe and elsewhere then, and if you don't exactly remember beyond just the fuzziest edges of it what 9/11 was like to live through, you're not going to have the natural hawkishness towards all of these other nations, all these other countries, all these other conflicts across the world that, say, a boomer or a Gen Xer might. In fact, you'll probably pay a lot closer attention to some of the domestic concerns that we have. You lived through a financial crisis, or through COVID-caused, lockdown-caused, financial depression. Those tend to be the orientations that younger people have, and that's okay, I think.
Yeah, well, and I think something important to note about that, too, is that some of the economic crises that we've lived through, as members of Gen Z, have been caused by globalism. Yeah. They've been caused by our increased interest in other countries.
You can't have a global financial crisis unless you have a global financial market.
Right. Exactly. And I kind of noticed this, and I love this piece by Jake because I think it makes some really important distinctions. Like, my parents are young Gen Xers. So like my mom was, she did a study abroad program in Germany, and like distinctly remembers, post, Berlin Wall falling Germany. And, for people who came up like kind of in the Reagan era of conservatism, they still very much see the world through that lens. So Russia is our number one geopolitical foe. And, my dad, who, was in the Marine Corps, in the 90s, was still available to be called up after September 11th. So, even their Middle East policy is I don't want to say tainted. That makes it sound like I think my parents' ideas are dumb. But that's kind of why they believe what they believe, because they came up in that era. Whereas for a lot of young people our age, kind of the consensus that I can kind of come up with is, who cares? It really seems to be the way that people think about, issues in other countries now. We talked a little bit about, moralizing by our betters in the foreign policy establishment. And really it seems to be resoundingly young people are like, who cares? I can't afford to buy a house. I can't afford to get married. I can't afford to have more than one kid. I think people have bigger fish to fry now. And that I think foreign policy is an issue that, is divided by generation, maybe more than any other.
I think that's exactly right. And it dovetails perfectly with a question we got from a listener. Just a reminder, you can get your question answered by us on the podcast as well if you rate and review the podcast 5 stars on any platform. And if you don't feel like putting your question directly in the review, you can send us an email with a screenshot of your 5-star review to podcast@americanmoment.org. This question comes from B-Dog McNug, a very please don't use your podcast review names as a way to make me say progressively more ridiculous things. I'm probably going to result in that.
You can just start making me read.
Yeah, I'm fully expecting a review request from BOFA at some point. But anyway, this person asked a question sort of having to do with the episode we did with Russ Vought, who's President Trump's director of the Office of Management and Budget. He pushed back a little bit on some of the deficit hawk concerns that Russ had talked about in his episode, which we did a little bit of a back and forth with Russ as well. But his question boiled down to this, which is, what can the new right offer regular people economically that the left can't? I think it's a really interesting question. And one way that I like to boil it down and think about it is that the new right has a, I think, sophisticated and realistic understanding of human nature and what human flourishing looks like. Whereas the left is now pushing a universal daycare scheme as the be-all and end-all to ensure that, families are fully liberated from the consequences of parenthood. The right says, no, it's affirmatively a good thing for you to raise your own children, and we're going to come up with ways to financially ensure that you're capable of doing that, whether that's things like expanding the child tax credit, maybe more generous family leave benefits, or other things. That's certainly one that I think is extremely important.
Yeah, I think one of the things about the left, and particularly the progressive left, is that it's it seems almost so cold and unfeeling, right? Mm-hmm. They're focused on community, but only as a chance to have BP sponsored picnics. It's they don't really care about community or about family or about your involvement with a local church or anything like that. And I think that's something that the new right has particularly focused on. We've had these child allowance bills from Senators Romney, Rubio, and Hawley have all proposed their own. They're different in a couple different ways, but I think the GOP's focus on the family is very heartening for me as someone who wants to have a family in the next couple of years. And I don't think it's something you'll see the left taking on anytime soon. Like Saurabh mentioned, it mainly seems to be that they want to outsource care of your child to mm-hmm. cheap immigrants that they can import by the shipload.
Yeah.
And would rather them take care of your children while you work 5 days a week, 9-10 mm-hmm. hours a day for a wage. What the left wants is to import people to take care of your kids while you slave away for wages. And it's just cold and unfeeling. It doesn't appeal to me. I don't think it should appeal to anyone who wants to have a family and wants to be a part of their community. And I think it's something that I've seen the right do a lot better on since President Trump.
I think that the immigration issue is another great example, right? Is that I think that in some ways the squeakiest wheel, that one secret trick to make sure that you have low wage growth in America is keeping limits on your immigration levels. By having a porous border that allows for unlimited illegal immigration, but also one where there's all sorts of different ridiculous legal immigration schemes, whether it's H-1B, H-2B, OPT, or stapling green cards to diplomas, as certain people like to say. Those are all things that expand the pool of available labor and necessarily drive the price down. I keep getting told by market mechanisms, by free market absolutists, but the one where they always come up with very esoteric and elaborate reasons to believe the market mechanism doesn't exist is with the labor market.
Yeah, I'm told supply and demand is a thing. One time people said this.
Yeah, well, apparently it's for all the reasons that are a little bit too complicated to explain to you, Nick. It isn't. That's what people say, and that's the thing is having a well-rooted and realistic and frankly not utopian conception of human nature is what the right can offer in general when it comes to these economic conversations, while being unshackled from some of the free market absolutism that has characterized the right over the last 30 to 40 years. I think that we have a lot that we can say when it comes to a substantively conservative economics that actually supports families in America, because that's what a decent economy would do.
Well, and I think, going back to the episode that we just recorded with John, I think the important lens through which to view these things is this in the national interest, for the people of the United States of America? And I think we can say wholeheartedly that unfettered legal and illegal immigration is not. So I think that's like the only way that you can view all of these issues is like what's good for the American people. And it's the moral responsibility of the people in charge to be doing that. And they're not. They're abdicating that responsibility.
Absolutely. Well, if you'd like to ask a question like this, please feel free to, once again, email podcast@americanmoment.org with a screenshot of your 5-star review, or ask it directly in the review text itself. We're going to go through a couple of these every week. But for now, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production, filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.